When Clint Eastwood stepped onto the brightly lit stage of one of the most watched talk shows in America, the audience expected just another Hollywood interview. The young, sharp-tongued host, Samantha Reed, was known for dismantling her guests with quick jabs and viral, gotcha, moments. She thought she was about to make an example out of Eastwood, exposing him as outdated, irrelevant, a relic of the past. But what she didn't know was that Clint wasn't just another guest. And what happened next would become legendary, as the Hollywood icon delivered a masterclass in strength, resilience, and the power of speaking the truth. It was a stage set for spectacle. The studio lights blazed down, illuminating the sleek, modern set. The audience buzzed with anticipation, eyes locked on the stage where something big was about to happen. At the center of it all sat Samantha Reed, a young, blonde, sharp-dressed TV host with a reputation for delivering viral, gotcha moments. She was the media's rising star, a progressive firebrand known for putting her guests on the spot and watching them squirm. She thrived on confrontation, on cornering public figures and exposing their so-called outdated ways of thinking. Tonight, she had a new target: Clint Eastwood, Hollywood legend, director, actor, icon, a man who had lived more in a decade than most would in a lifetime. He had built his career playing the kind of men that didn't apologize for who they were, rugged, tough, and straight to the point. To Samantha and her audience, he was a relic from a different time, a time they were convinced had no place in today's world. And that's exactly why he was here. The network executives weren't subtle about what they wanted. They expected Samantha to expose him, make him look old-fashioned, out of touch, maybe even problematic. A clip of him stumbling through a question, fumbling for words. That's what would go viral. That's what would get clicks, retweets, and headlines. But Clint Eastwood wasn't here to play their game. He sat comfortably in his chair, legs apart, back straight, arms resting lazily on the armrests. No nervous glances, no rehearsed answers, just a man who had seen it all and wasn't about to let some young TV host lecture him on the world. Samantha adjusted her posture, flashing a polished smile. The cameras were rolling, the audience was locked in, and the energy in the room crackled with expectation. She had done this 100 times before. But something about the way Clint sat there, calm, unmoving, eyes sharp as ever, made it clear this wasn't going to go the way she thought. Samantha crossed her legs, pen poised between her fingers. She had the look of someone who knew she was in control. She tilted her head slightly, smirking. Clint, you've built your career on playing the rugged, stoic man's man, but don't you think that image is, well, outdated? The audience chuckled, a few members nodding, already anticipating Eastwood's slow realization that his time had passed. But he didn't flinch. Instead, he gave a slow, deliberate nod, not because he agreed, but because he was letting the moment hang just long enough for everyone to feel it. Then he leaned in just slightly, not aggressive, not defensive, just firm. You mean outdated like telling the truth? Silence. Then a shift. The chuckles in the audience faltered, some morphing into nervous laughter. Samantha's smirk tightened just a little, the confidence in her eyes flickering. She hadn't expected him to flip it on her so fast. Well, she recovered, keeping her tone light. I just mean the times have changed. The world doesn't run on that old-fashioned tough guy mentality anymore. Clint exhaled, shaking his head just slightly, like a man who had heard this all before. Yeah, he said, voice slow and steady. Times have changed. But people? He tilted his head. Not as much as you think. The audience was quiet now, waiting. You think toughness is outdated? You ever meet a firefighter? He asked. His voice wasn't raised, but it cut through the room like a blade. A cop? A soldier? You ever talk to a single mother working 2 jobs to keep food on the table? Samantha blinked. I mean, she started. Sure, but, yeah, he interrupted, sitting back, gaze locked on her. Didn't think so. A few gasps rippled through the audience. A couple of claps. Samantha opened her mouth to take back control. But Clint had already shifted. Like a gunfighter who had already drawn first. You can sit here and tell me toughness is outdated. He continued, but the second something goes wrong in your life, the second you're in real trouble. He leaned in, his eyes sharp. You're going to be looking for someone like me. The tension in the room changed. Samantha forced another smile, but the audience wasn't laughing at Clint anymore. For the first time, the host wasn't leading the interview. Clint Eastwood was. And he wasn't finished yet. Samantha didn't back down. She shifted in her chair, leaning forward. Her voice carried a hint of challenge. Her eyes narrowed just slightly. But don't you think masculinity today should be more inclusive? More in touch with emotions? Clint Eastwood didn't flinch. He sat back in his chair, shoulders relaxed, eyes locking onto hers with a cool intensity that never wavered. The room seemed to hold its breath as he exhaled slowly, his gaze unwavering. You ever seen a firefighter cry about being too tough when they're running into a burning building? There it was. The words hung in the air like a punch that had just landed hard. The entire room stiffened. The audience seemed to collectively pause, as if trying to process the gravity of the question. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded slowly, as if realizing the simplicity and truth in his words. Samantha blinked. She hadn't expected that. Her confident facade cracked just a little. That's not the same thing, she replied, trying to hold her ground. Though her voice faltered, Clint didn't give an inch. What? You don't think those guys have emotions? He asked. His tone still calm yet undeniably firm. But they still go in. They still do the job. No matter what. The crowd was quiet now, absorbing the weight of his words. There was no quick comeback. No snarky comment. Just a seasoned man speaking truth in a way that was impossible to argue with. You think toughness is a bad thing? Clint continued, his voice steady. You ever try to do something when everything's against you? You ever pick yourself up when no one's there to help? Toughness isn't about being a bully. It's about standing tall when the world's trying to knock you down. Samantha's mouth opened and closed a few times. But the words weren't there. The audience, once divided, was now firmly on Clint's side. Samantha took a breath, trying to regroup. She had one more card to play. She shuffled her cue cards slightly, adjusting her posture as if preparing for the final round. Okay, Clint, but let's talk about your movies. They glorify violence, right? I mean, isn't that sending the wrong message to young people? Shouldn't we be teaching them conflict resolution instead? Clint's lips twitched into a small smirk. The crowd could sense the change in his demeanor. This was no longer about defense. This was his turn to dictate the conversation. You ever see a movie where the hero saved the day by filing a complaint? He asked, his voice low but dripping with a quiet confidence. The room erupted. Laughter rippled through the audience, some even applauding. It wasn't just the words, it was the delivery. Clint wasn't playing by Samantha's rules, he was rewriting the script. Samantha's smile tightened, her grip on the situation slipping even further. She hadn't expected him to be so sharp, so quick. This wasn't the same man she had prepared to deconstruct. Clint leaned back in his chair, seemingly unbothered by the laughter that filled the studio. Movies are movies, he said, shrugging slightly. It's entertainment, but they're also a reflection of the world people are living in. The world isn't soft, Samantha. It's a tough place. And sometimes you need a little toughness to make it through. The words hung in the air. Samantha tried to get back on track. But the crowd's reaction made it clear that Clint Eastwood had just changed the game. Her confidence, once unshakable, was now deeply in question. Samantha adjusted her posture, her polished TV host smile still in place. But something was different now. She wasn't leading the conversation anymore, Clint was. And the audience felt it too. She needed to regain control. And fast. Taking a breath, she tried a different angle. "But don't you think old-school toughness has led to toxic masculinity?" she asked. Her tone careful but pointed. "Wouldn't society be better if men didn't feel the need to be so aggressive?" The audience murmured, sensing the weight of the question. A few heads nodded in agreement. This was her moment. If she could get him to stumble, to admit that traditional masculinity was outdated, she could reframe the conversation. But Clint Eastwood didn't hesitate. His expression didn't change. He simply leaned forward, resting his elbows on the armrests. Eyes steady. Then, in that signature low, deliberate voice, he asked, "Would you say that to a single mother working 2 jobs to keep food on the table?" Silence, not just from Samantha, but from the entire audience. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. The energy in the room shifted again. This wasn't about masculinity anymore. This was about resilience. About survival. About real toughness. Clint let the moment linger, his gaze unwavering. Then he continued, voice even but firm. "You think toughness is just about throwing punches? It's about pushing forward when life is hard. It's about standing up when no one else will. You take that away from people. Tell them it's a bad thing. And what do you have left?" The audience wasn't laughing anymore, they were listening. Samantha swallowed. She had planned for this interview, studied her talking points, rehearsed her approach. But she hadn't planned for this. And worse, she was losing them. Samantha wasn't smiling anymore. She shifted slightly in her chair, gripping her cue cards a little tighter. This wasn't going how it was supposed to. The audience wasn't looking at her anymore, they were looking at him. She needed to break this momentum fast. If she couldn't win the argument, she could at least make him look old-fashioned, out of touch. With a practiced exhale, she went for it. "You've been accused of being out of touch," she said, tilting her head slightly, her voice edged with something sharper now. "Do you think your fans are just people who don't want to accept change?" There it was, the setup. If she could paint him as a relic of the past, the audience would be reminded that he wasn't someone to take seriously anymore. But Clint just sat there. And then he smiled, a slow, knowing smile. And then, in the kind of calm, collected tone that made it feel like the whole world had just slowed down, he delivered the line that would be replayed millions of times across the internet. "Funny thing about change," he said, voice steady, "not all of its progress." Boom! The crowd erupted. Some people clapped, some cheered, others simply sat there nodding, absorbing the weight of what he had just said. Even some of Samantha's own crew members exchanged glances. Samantha's smile didn't return. She blinked, searching for the right words to regain control. But how do you argue with that? The shift was undeniable. The audience wasn't waiting for her next question anymore. They were waiting for Clint's next answer. She wasn't leading this interview, he was. And for the first time, she knew it. Samantha's face was composed, but the cracks were there. The once confident TV host, known for cutting down guests with sharp questions and progressive talking points, was now struggling to regain control. She had one last attempt left. Taking a steadying breath, she leaned in, softening her voice. If she couldn't beat Clint in a debate, she could at least make him seem cold, emotionless, someone who didn't understand the modern world. "But don't you think toughness sometimes stops people from showing vulnerability?" she asked. Her voice edged with just enough sympathy to sway the crowd back to her side. "Isn't it okay to admit when we're struggling?" The audience murmured. It was a smart pivot, one that played well on camera. But Clint Eastwood, he had seen real struggle. And he wasn't buying it. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head just slightly. Then, in that signature gravelly tone, he delivered the final blow. Toughness is knowing when to fight and when to stand your ground. Silence. He let the words settle before continuing. Voice even but firm. The world doesn't care about your feelings. It asks if you can handle what's coming. Boom. That was it. The room erupted. People clapped. Some stood up. A few let out sharp whistles of approval. Even some of the studio crew, the very people who had expected this to go differently, were nodding along. Samantha was frozen, blinking, scrambling for anything to grab onto. But there was nothing left. This wasn't just about Clint Eastwood winning the interview. It was about him proving that old-school values, discipline and resilience, weren't outdated. They were essential. And right now, the world was eating it up. The tables weren't just turned, the entire game had changed. The second the cameras cut to commercial, Samantha yanked out her earpiece. Her team rushed toward her, whispering frantic damage control strategies. It didn't matter, because by the time she even left the stage, the internet had already decided who won. Within minutes, clips of the interview were everywhere. Eastwood School's clueless host. This is why Hollywood legends still matter. Samantha thought she'd win. Big mistake. Hashtags exploded. Memes flooded Twitter. YouTube compilations popped up within the hour, complete with dramatic music and slow-motion replays of Clint's final lines. Meanwhile, the network panicked. Producers scrambled to edit the footage, trying to cut parts before they went online. They called up YouTube, issued copyright strikes, tried to push a different narrative. Too late. The clips had already been downloaded, re-uploaded millions of times. And the internet wasn't just watching, they were celebrating. On Reddit, entire threads analyzing the interview racked up thousands of upvotes. On Facebook, older generations were applauding Eastwood for standing his ground. Even younger audiences, ones who had never even watched an Eastwood film, were commenting. This guy just gets it. Samantha? She stayed quiet. No Twitter posts. No Instagram stories. No attempts at a clever comeback. Because no amount of spin could change what had just happened. Clint Eastwood had walked into a modern battlefield. A world built on cancel culture, scripted narratives, and forced talking points. And he had walked out without a scratch. Samantha Reed was nowhere to be found. The morning after the interview, social media was still on fire. News outlets picked up the story. Headlines flashing across every major network. Clint Eastwood shuts down progressive host in viral interview. The moment that ended Samantha Reed's credibility. How a Hollywood legend exposed the media's double standard. But Samantha? Nothing. No tweets. No Instagram posts. No carefully worded reflection statements. Just silence. Her network, scrambling to save face, released a lukewarm, corporate-approved statement. We at Global Talk believe in fostering conversations that reflect a wide range of perspectives. We appreciate Mr. Eastwood's participation in last night's interview and remain committed to open dialogue. It was the media equivalent of a shrug. And no one bought it. The comment sections under their post were brutal. This is the PR way of saying we got wrecked and we don't know what to do. Lol at wide range of perspectives. You guys thought you were going to embarrass him. And he made you look ridiculous. Clint Eastwood just ended a career without even trying. Samantha's credibility, once untouchable, was now in serious free fall. Her audience, the people who had cheered her on in countless other interviews, weren't defending her this time. Some tried to spin it. They called the interview a calculated ambush, or claimed Clint's fans were just nostalgic for a time that never really existed. But the damage was already done. The truth was, Samantha hadn't just lost a debate, she had lost the room. She had walked into that interview expecting to corner a Hollywood legend. To make him look irrelevant, outdated, a relic of the past. But Clint? He never played the game. And that's why he won. Days later, the hype should have died down. But it didn't, because the internet wasn't done talking about Clint Eastwood. It wasn't just an interview anymore. It had become a moment, a rare instance where someone, without a script, without media training, without an agenda, stood firm in what he believed and let the world decide. And people were still deciding. Then it happened, a paparazzi clip, nothing fancy. Just a shaky camera and a TMZ logo in the corner, surfaced on social media. Clint Eastwood, walking out of a steakhouse in Los Angeles. A young reporter rushed up, microphone in hand. "Mr. Eastwood, did you expect your interview to go so viral?" Clint paused mid-step. He turned his head slightly, gave the reporter a look, one of those classic Clint Eastwood looks. The kind that could make a man rethink his whole life. Then he chuckled, shrugged. "Didn't expect anything," he said, voice calm as ever. "Just said what I meant. That's rare these days." And just like that, the internet exploded all over again. The video spread across Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. It didn't matter where you looked. Clint's words were everywhere. People took those 9 words and turned them into memes. Motivational quotes. Reaction videos. Just said what I meant. That's rare these days. It was simple. It was true. And it hit harder than any speech ever could. Meanwhile, Samantha Reed? Still silent. Because what could she say? No carefully worded response. No damage control statement. No think piece from a media ally could undo what had already happened. Clint Eastwood hadn't just won a debate. He had reminded people of something they'd forgotten. Real strength doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need approval. It just needs to be real. And that's why people still listen to Clint Eastwood. Even now. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.